very much, Tan Sri, Syed, Hamid, Albar, for a completely different perspective on this whole issue. Yeah, and to summarize what Tan Sri said, I mean, blaming China, it's like it's quite pointless. It's like the pot calling the kettle black. Yeah, because others have been have been doing the same thing. Yeah, so very interesting perspective. And before I move on to question time, I would like to invite Brother Osman Softic. Yeah, just to say a few words, just to share a few words, because he was the one who was supposed to be moderating this session today. Yes, Brother Osman.
Thank you, Brother Naguib, and good morning, good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum to everyone. I apologize for not being able to join you earlier because of the technical difficulties, unfortunately, with the internet. As Brother Naguib said, I was supposed to moderate this event. However, I am much more happier to participate and to listen and learn in this way. Anyway, I apologize to the speakers, particularly the ones that I missed, Dr. Maung Zarni and Professor Dr. Ramon, to have missed their presentations, but hopefully I'll compensate that in the remainder of the discussions. So pleased to meet you all, and I'm glad that the Islamic Renaissance Front, as always, brings different views and different perspectives. So after all, its motto is لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for people who think. So the idea obviously is to generate different ideas, different perspectives, and foster more discussion and more reflections on this immensely important topic, which is really globally paramount at the moment, I think. So thank you very much, Brother Naguib, please.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Osman. So before I move on to take questions from the audience, I would like to let our panelists for today, I would like to give each of them 5 minutes to comment on Tan Sri Albar's perspective on this issue. Yeah, maybe I would like to start first with Didi.
Thanks very much. I think 5 minutes is very generous. I'll try to take less than that. I hope there's some time for questions as well. And also because I know other people have so much interesting stuff to say. I think, on the issue of, I suppose on the issue that Tan Sri touched on it very interestingly about whether things are all the same, like, that China's great power projection is the same as United States great power projection. I suppose I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea that, everything's the same. I think that there are differences. I'm not saying which is better, which is worse, but I think we need to differentiate a little bit because, and a lot of this relates back to the nature of the power that backs these power projections going outward, if you like. Clearly there's turmoil in the US now, but I think also great capacity for renewal and regeneration. And that's, to me, a hopeful sign. I mean, we've seen real problems, but in fact, many parts of US society have held steady. I think, politics is maybe the wobbliest. That's not surprising. Justice system, military, they've held steady, and this sort of riot and insurrection, whatever we want to call it, we'll see what happens going forward. And I actually think at some point too that maybe it's time for places like that feel they've benefited from the US. And I know that's a controversial viewpoint for some people, but to actually, take on more responsibility themselves and say, well, look, how can we help the situation going forward now? History is long, it's complex. And I think Tan Sri's point is well made about ASEAN. It's very disunited. We have a similar situation in Europe. Maybe there's a lot more that ASEAN and the EU could do together to try and forge alternative, positive voices that are intent on maybe not just falling under the wheels of either Beijing or Washington. And also the issue of transparency, completely agree. The thing that, you know, with transparency and the debt issue with China, it's so interesting because, yes, these companies are by and large state-owned enterprises. I think as of 2017, there were more than 3,000 individual projects carried out under BRI by state-owned enterprises in China. There'll be, you know, probably quite a bit more by now. And of course, you know, the thing about state-owned companies is that, well, they're state-owned, so why aren't they more transparent? Why don't we know more about the terms of these agreements that should, in theory, be very easy to mandate greater transparency? And I completely agree about the transparency issue. It's maybe the most democratic issue of all. So, and I support it very, very strongly personally. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, when it comes to colonialism, Southeast Asia has had a lot of history of that, and the Philippines had been under U.S. colonialism, violently invaded by the U.S. forces in the turn of the last century. And from that time of the U.S. invasion, the Philippines has never really had a independent foreign policy. You know, it's always been oriented towards the United States. And for Filipinos, the encroachments, the very blatant encroachments of China into what are very clearly Philippine territory, very clearly what Philippine territory, I mean, in the sense of exclusive economic zone. China is claiming waters which are actually very, very close already to Philippine shores, very unreasonably so in our thinking. So, and that's projected not through diplomacy, not through agreements, but by brute force. The use of brute force in what they call the South China Sea. So that calls to mind U.S. power projection, U.S. force, U.S. invasion for Filipinos, for many Filipinos. However, historically, you know, some Filipinos think that U.S. Colonialism, neocolonialism, it's better than Chinese neocolonialism or imperialism. And some reasons that may arise there may also have something to do with a racist attitude towards the Chinese. You know, and I think that's not just a Philippine issue. And I think it's wrong too to have a racist attitude to the Chinese. That's very wrong. Racism is wrong everywhere. But one aspect of this, you know, more favorable perception of U.S. or Western colonialism is also founded on the racist ideologies that they've been spreading in Asia. So I think, and in addition to that, in addition to the problem of the South China Sea, you know, I've already mentioned all these contracts and all the anomalous terms that these contracts contain. So I think in the interest of economic development in the Philippines, of our political independence, we should not enter into these onerous contracts, regardless of any, let's say, if we're talking about any grandiose strategic plans of China or whatnot, or any kind of larger objectives of power projection. I think it's the interest of the Philippines, and not just the Philippines, other Southeast Asian nations, to refuse to enter into such onerous contracts, which China is forcing upon us. So that has something to do, of course, with the power to negotiate from a certain position. So this all redounds, of course, to the ambitions, to the objectives and visions of many Southeast Asian countries to actually have an independent foreign policy, to actually have democratic polities, to actually be able to assert ourselves and at least attain some degree of prosperity for ordinary people in our countries. So for us, at least for many of us here, or for myself, it's not a question of choosing which power we should cling to, but in what context, in what geopolitical situation can we assert are the interests of our peoples. And I'm saying this not in the sense of, of the Western imperialistic assertion, and that's probably what the Chinese are doing now, of our national interests over those of other nations. I'm talking about pursuing a kind of, in Southeast Asia, a kind of a community of nations which are less imperialistic in attitude and more cooperative and more oriented towards a commonwealth of nations that help each other and pursue each other's independence. So that's just my perspective on this. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Well, firstly, the most important thing, at least to me, out of this conversation has to be that China cannot simply be seen as one of many money lenders, development or otherwise. Yeah, China, like any other great powers, do not give out free lunches. And I agree with Tanstri. China is behaving in manners that are no different from other great powers, colonizers, or like neo-colonizers. However, I think I would not discount the crucial element of intentionality behind China's behavior. No states act out of whims. States calculate interests, risks, and then China does the same thing. What distinguishes China and its intentionality from, let's just say, the United States is this. US at home is a solid republic, yeah? And it has gone through many domestic challenges, and it has survived. It has space for domestic self-correction. It has space for citizen influence over the development of its policies, either abroad, as in the form of anti-Vietnam War movement, or China's American policies towards Latin America, which amounted to neo-colonialism or indirect control. But in sharp contrast, China is a totalitarian state, becoming the second richest in the world, and a fast militarized state, ready or preparing to project its militaristic powers, whether in South China Sea, Africa, or other places. Secondly, whether we should be appreciative of the fact that developmental states of Southeast Asia need China's money. I think I would look at this way. For instance, like just look at a single project, multi-billion-dollar project in Burma. China's building this strategic alternative route to transport oil to bypass the Straits of Malacca that could be jeopardized militarily and otherwise by US and other US allies in the event of a military conflict. So Burma offers an alternative oil pipeline route from the western Burmese coast of Rakhine all the way to Kunming and then beyond. If you look at that single project of pipeline, actually twin pipeline, gas and oil, gas from offshore Burmese reserves and oil from the Middle East coming from out of Strait of Hormuz. That project, multi-billion-dollar investment, benefits a handful of Burmese janitors and a few Burmese prostitutes that the Chinese company fly from places like Mandalay, to service the Chinese engineers and whatnot that run this single project. There are so many infrastructure projects where local communities not only do they not benefit from these in terms of their well-being, but the environmental destruction. Say, for instance, if a U.S. company comes in and invests in certain things, and the local labor unrest, put a stop to it, U.S. company cannot openly or even indirectly ask the Burmese military to go and shoot the protesters. But in sharp contrast, that's precisely what the Chinese company, state-run company, that is part of the Norinco. Norinco is one of the largest Chinese manufacturers. In a place called Lepetao, copper and gold mining, the Chinese company essentially asked the Burmese military to send in troops and shoot the local farmers who protest, massive land confiscation and environmental degradation of their communities because of the Chinese company's mining practices. You see, so that thirdly and finally, I think the lack of ASEAN common position stems from the fact that ASEAN regimes, most of them, do not actually protect, promote the well-being of their own local communities. I mean, look at MNO itself. I mean, MNO with massive, like a multi-billion-dollar, theft from the development fund for the people. It's just one example, So that's why we need to disaggregate the term national interest. Whose interests are being served when an ASEAN national government, enters into these contracts, whether like the Manila or Putrajaya or Naypyidaw in Burma or the Phnom Penh. So Hun Sen has allowed China to turn Cambodia into unofficial colony of China, while amassing hundreds of millions of dollars in wealth for him and his cronies, right? Whereas in fact, Cambodian people are seething with rage that the country is turned into this brothel of resources to the Chinese interest. So I think this is really important. That's why I think, the internal political development of ASEAN states is directly linked with ASEAN regimes' inability to formulate a common position to enter into multilateral relations. Of course, all great powers are going to go for bilateral, the relations, because that's where the strategic dominance of the great powers can be established, maintained. So that's why I think I would not simply look at what is happening in the U.S. and say, I think that's where the Republican nature of the United States and also like European countries that becomes so important for ASEAN countries, whereas in fact China as a neo-totalitarian state at home and aspiring number one multi sort of civilizational colonial state abroad, a colonial power. I think this is the defining distinguishing feature that the ASEAN states and the China relation assume vis-a-vis the past colonial powers.
Let me ask Didi this question from the audience, a question from Chi Kyong Tan. Yeah, so the question is, China always uses historical argument to explain that their rise would not have adverse effect on Southeast Asian, African and other developing countries because China historically was inward looking rather than outward looking. Contrarily, historically it was the Western countries that used to entrap Southeast Asian, African, and other developing countries economically and culturally, and turn them in debt to the Western countries for decades, if not centuries. Of course, this is a Chinese argument for their own sake, but do you think this argument is convincing? Can we trust China just based on the historical argument?
Thank you. That's a great question. It depends how you define China. You know, I mean, what is the original China, if you like? What if we're going to talk about civilizational issues, which I think is very important with China, obviously, it is a civilization. We need to perhaps discuss what, you know, China sees itself as today. I mean, originally, there'd been many dynasties. China has changed shape, it's changed size. Xinjiang, it's worth pointing out that the word Xinjiang means new boundary, new border. And I often think, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I still consider myself a Hong Konger, which I think is a privilege. I'm very grateful for that. It's, you know, we have an area in Hong Kong called the New Territories. It's north of so-called Boundary Street that the Brits established in Hong Kong. Xinjiang basically means new territories, and it was taken by the Qing, militarily invaded over the course of quite a long time during the Qing dynasty. When you look at the situation of the Uyghur peoples now in Xinjiang, and the forced labor and the camps issues, which are certainly genuinely happening, as well as the sterilization issues, you know, their problems didn't just begin recently in 2017. You go back to the 1930s, you go back to the Soviet Union and the impact of the Soviet communism on the Western, you know, on Western China, on Central Asia, on Xinjiang, and you see that the trauma there that they live with is multi-generational. So my point being, that's one example of how the borders of China have changed. And I think if you were to ask Uyghur people what they think about the argument that China does not have the ability to be aggressive, including militarily aggressive, I think they'll just laugh in your face. Another example might be India. We've got actual border conflict in India. At least 20 Indian soldiers dead recently, so, you know, up in the mountain region. So Indian general, ex-general, said that he thought that therefore there would be about 40 Chinese soldiers dead. We haven't got a figure for how many Chinese soldiers died in that awful clash, because Beijing never ever releases these kinds of information. It's part of their control over the discourse of power, to not ever reveal that kind of damage or weakness. I don't know how many, you know, Chinese government spokesman said, you know, I can confirm that there were not 40 Chinese casualties. So I don't know how many there were, 39, 41, 17, we have no idea. It was a clever way to phrase it of Zhao Lijian, the guy in question. So I think, you know, the CCP itself claims that China doesn't have the DNA to be aggressive, to be militarily aggressive. I think that's just kind of silly, because in fact we see all the time parallel a propagation of quite an aggressive, you know, I mean, not just rhetoric, but also military build-up, which is really very, very fast, having come off a very low base. And, you know, people like to say, well, but the United States military is so much bigger, so much more expensive. True. What they often don't understand, I think, is, and I'm not defending, you know, US actions here necessarily, but I'm just saying that as a point of information, a lot of the US military budget is actually in entitlements. It's in things like healthcare and pension and conditions and stuff like that. It's not actually in weapon systems or stuff, which are there too, of course. But one needs to actually disaggregate the US military budget to arrive at anything approaching a good comparison with what China is spending on its own new military systems, because China's costs in these areas for maintaining a standing army are far, far lower. I mean, you know, it's like the labor differential between China and the US, if you like. It's a similar situation. So I'll just say that, you know, I do think that any power that's rising has the potential to be highly aggressive. Yes, Germany did it. You could say the US did it. Yep. China's doing it. So I don't totally buy, you know, I don't buy at all, in fact, these arguments that China is innately peaceful, if that's what the question was. It's a little bit my own interpretation. But I think just, you know, we shouldn't see China as different just because it's a civilizational power. Thanks.
Thank you, Didi. So now I have a question for Tan Sri Albar, who earlier, remember, Tan Sri Albar turned the tables and has since been enjoying the show quietly while munching guaci. Yeah, so we have now a question for Tan Sri Albar, yeah, from Apichai Sunchinda, who is from Thailand and is currently an independent expert and formerly working at the ASEAN Secretariat and the ASEAN Foundation. So the question is, you would probably recall that ASEAN back in 1996 established an ASEAN Mekong Basin Development Corporation, or AMBDC, comprising of all the now 10 ASEAN member countries plus China, or a 10+1 configuration. However, over the years, it somehow lost its direction in its original purpose of having a common position in engagement with China for mutual interests. Eventually, the only flagship project discussed is the Singapore Kunming Railway, or SKRL, and as we know now, China is the only player financing the construction of this railway. The AMBDC is now in limbo, having its last meeting some 6 or more years ago, and there is even talk of disbanding it. Is this a lost opportunity to an original good idea on the part of ASEAN, or can it be revived, especially in the current context of what this webinar is addressing?
Thank you, Najib. You have allowed everyone to comment on what I said. But which has created some, I think, a different view from what I actually expressed. Say, for example, I take in the case of being same. When I talk about being the same, I'm talking about major powers. As a major power, they have certain behavior and attitude. I'm not talking about a system internally or their foreign policy projection. I think it's a different system. China has got a different system. US has got a different system. Of course, in our case, we think that we try to follow as closely as possible to the US system. So I think the very question that my friend from Thailand asked is is how ASEAN has evolved. ASEAN wants to create a community. After the Bali Concord 1, 2, and then after that, we started to have our desire to have a community. But how can you create a community if you don't integrate your views and policies and development on certain common platform? When we formed ASEAN, it was formed in order to avoid big power rivalry in South Asia. But now, ASEAN is already a theater of big power rivalry. So it's, everything get defocused. So there is less, there is still, we have to overcome our suspicion of each other, our trust on each other, so that we can undertake common project. The Kunming project, because China is a driving force, Kunming project is the only one. China is encouraging all the ASEAN countries to have either fast train or high-speed train. So if they have that, then we will be able to achieve that. The rest, I think, ASEAN has to, I think has got to go back to its drawing board and see what are the projects that we can undertake that will bring development. We divide ourselves. We have Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, then we have the Mekong Valley, all these things. There is no integration of what we want to achieve. Even air connection between ASEAN countries, we are not integrated. It's more difficult for us to move from one country to another. So it will be for a long time. I don't think it is abandoned. If you go through all our decisions and documents, it's thousands of them, it's very thick. So I hope the new generation will take the opportunity to relook at some of the things that we can do that will bring benefit to the people. I think another thing that I like to mention, I think it will be you know, the 9 points, I think Dr. Ramon may have mentioned the 9 points that China based its claim, historical points, that was rejected by the International Arbitration Court. But in the case of, in that situation, it was rejected because China do not recognize the decision. And there is, from the start, we took a conceptual approach of the subject, and we know that it cannot be implemented. Many of ICJ or International Court, it cannot be implemented unless it's ICJ decision, where all the parties agree to it. So the ASEAN 1996 is not totally off, but it's not upfront. So we need to do something about it. And I think let us look at how ASEAN can move together, just in order to create a better working environment for ASEAN countries. I've got actually so many things that I want to comment on. I think what we have said about, we hope there will be a renewal, regeneration. I think the ASEAN countries also have got the same ambition. I believe the current regime in ASEAN, they have to change. They have to give opportunity to the youth to have a fresh look at what our future should be. Because at present, we are still with old legacy, the old baggage is still there. And none of the things that we are talking about, ASEAN can do it because we are not progressing in democracy. We are actually regressing in democracy. So we need to put our house in order, like what my friend Professor Zarni said, when China negotiated about, and the fault is not the fault of China. The fault is with our own national government, for not taking the best interest of its people in order for us to get the best deal. I don't consider that all lenders are crooks. For your information, Najib, I was a banker. So if you see, so I think without a bank, we can't function. But I take exception if you say all of them are crooks. You have to distinguish between bankers and money lenders. So these are two different set of people. I was an investment banker as well as commercial banker. So I think I have given a lot of companies we have, into very good gestation. They have done very well, and they are now on doing, contributing to the development of the country, industry, employment. So but let us, I think, look at this issue of that threat, taking out the diplomacy, because it's a misnomer, I think, to have a diplomacy in that one. It's a dirty word for that threat. It cannot be diplomatic if you set a threat. So I think we should discuss further on the issue of this debt threat. How, especially developing countries, must get together to have a checklist amongst themselves, so that we can learn from the best practices, whether from the West or from anywhere else. So that's my comment to the 1996 ASEAN decision and what has happened to it. Thank you.
Thank you,
Najib, can I just take like
yes,
1 minute?
Please. Go ahead, Zarni.
One thing that we have not touched on is the populist nationalism in China. Yeah, we have not talked about, we focused on the CPC and the leadership, what the state's doing. But we have a situation, if you think like, Trumpism and MAGA ideology and 75 million Americans who voted for Trump and believe that, counterfactually, that the election was stolen. Well, we are looking at about, I don't know, 1.4 billion people in, most of whom have been, raised on this Chinese civilizational exceptionalism and nationalism, yeah, and that kind of a homegrown state or like elite-stoked nationalism in the past have led to the Holocaust in Germany. Germans felt that they were special, very rational people. Look where the rationality took the Third Reich too. You know, the Third Reich ended in gas chambers, right? And the total collapse of the Reich itself. And then look at like what's happening in the USA. You know, the white supremacies, you know, and then like you've got China with 1.5 billion people who believe that the Middle Kingdom has to re-arise again. Yeah, and so that trap cannot be understood outside the ideological grand narrative that CPC has generated. And finally, I think what frightens me most vis-a-vis the Western colonial histories in Southeast Asia is that China has many overseas pockets of you know, the Malay Chinese, Burmese Chinese. If you know, that's why I look at like, you know, what happened in the elections in the 2000 and you know, I think around last year, the Chinese Consul General in KL was, you know, basically trying to signal to the Malaysian society that the Malaysian Chinese need to be protected, right? And so the Malaysian Chinese are split along its loyalty or divided loyalties or allegiances to the Malaysian society and the Malaysia as their birth country, and their admiration and their nationalism, you know, in admiration, you know, with respect to the rise of China. The same can be said of Burma. So there are elements that are so ripe for China to take advantage to project its Middle Kingdom and its rightful place in the world. That is something that needs to be grappled with in connection with that trap, if there is such a thing as a trap.
Can I just say something?
Yes.
That's a short
Go
one.
ahead. Mhm.
Sorry. I think the discussion is getting more interesting. I think all this, what is happening, but what we are witnessing now, we seem to put the focus on China playing the dominant role and trying to create hegemony. I think we're all, if at all, I think what China has achieved and gained is because of US position. He has abandoned and isolated itself, and there is a vacuum, there is a gap in global leadership. And I think it's natural for any country, developing countries, especially small countries, they have to look for a bigger patron, a patron that could actually help them be covered. Is a question of covered. And I think the other thing very interesting, I've always considered this as a geopolitical issue, what Professor Zarni said. You see, in countries where China, or for that matter, India, and we have a local population, people who originate from those countries, I think there is always a problem of their sense of pride has changed, their sense of political identity have changed. You know, there are a lot of issues. It's a very dangerous. This is why I believe now politics of identity, politics of ethnicity is not going to grow. And whether based on religion, on race, on culture, and this is a thing that we need to watch very closely. And I think we should bear that in mind. Malaysia, I was very upset actually what Professor Zarni mentioned when I saw the statement from the Chinese Counselor or Chinese Ambassador. And they visited the Chinese area for certain. I was hoping that the Malaysian government would come up with a statement to say this is actually real interference with the internal affairs of a country. You know, I mean, but there was no statement. So I didn't follow Trump, but I tweeted. my tweet is not dangerous. So I think I hope, you know, the other thing maybe last that I want to say, you know, it is important for us not to be idealistic when we are living in a real world. In today's world, actually there is no independence or sovereignty. We have given up our independence and sovereignty. We signed so many treaties, we signed so many conventions, we are a member of the United Nations. The only problem with us as developing countries, why we talk about independence and sovereignty, is because we do not have the power, the ability to protect ourselves. So we are you know, we are just the subject of big power games. So I think it is important for us to that's why I believe that organization like before, non-aligned movement, organization like G77 without all the big, we should come together, because I think we are stronger in numbers, we are better consolidated and united, rather than, you know, trying to be the champion on our own, because we can't do that. We'll be subject to pressure, we're subject to influence. And I can tell you that as a former foreign minister, when you want to do something different, the influence or the pressure of the major powers are tremendous. The only thing is, people who don't play would not know. We know, because the type of things that we are subjected to as member of a small nation or small country, when we want to take an independent view, or we want to take a view that is different from the views or what is called conventional views, you know. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. On this point itself, on the point about more powerful nations, Abdul Muiz actually has a question for you. How do you see relations between China and Malaysia after Sheraton move with termination of HSR and the progress of ECRL?
Thank you very much for the question. I think first, the ECRL has not been terminated yet. And they have, I think the previous government have reduced the scope in order to make it less costly. The HSR came as a surprise because the PH government decided to reduce the scope and also, I think, and delay what was the agreement. But I think what the public is interested to know, for Azul, his view, what the public is interested to know, what type of financial damage, I mean, cost to the Malaysian public, because there is an agreement. So what happened in the agreement? We breached the agreement, we have to make payment. Like the ECRL, we have to make certain payments. There is certain default, there is considered already certain defaults. This is what I'm talking, that when we are, I think HSR, the feasibility study that was done to show that it is economic and viable was up to Singapore. Now if they talk about what up to Johor, and then it is to be connected with the RTS, Rapid Transit System of Singapore, first, what does it cost the Malaysian public to pay to Singapore? Two is that they have to redo their feasibility study and see whether it is enough for us, or we should just abandon the whole thing, because we have already got double track that is going to be completed in a couple of years' time, where the train will be fast train, not high speed, but it is fast train. So all these things are issues of contention. I hope that the Malaysian public becoming more critical, the Malaysian public debate on issues of public interest. If they don't, we just become a recipient, and you know, suddenly things are decided for us. Let us become a conscious member of the public, and especially the young. I think if the young like to watch what the old guys are playing, then it will not. And I think the future is for the young. We need to see a transition. We should be transient. People of my age should be transient. The people of 40 and below should be the one up in the forefront, or 50 and below up in the forefront, playing and trying to contribute.
Thank you, Tansri. Yeah, so I'll have, well, Tansri, you're still young. So now let me, this question is aimed at, just a bit younger. Yeah, a question for Professor Ramon. The question is asked by Dr. Imran Alisan now. The question is, China claims it is having peaceful rise because previously all other big powers use violence to get power, but China is not. So do you think that that is a choice of other states to be trapped and China's rise is peaceful?
Um, um, well, you'd have to look at the whole complexity of how what we call the rise of China. And if we look at its origins up to the present day, this has not been a peaceful process, a completely peaceful process. And we may say that, for example, that China, unlike the United States, has not projected its military force as aggressively in recent years. You know, most wars, most conflicts in the world have had something to do with the United States, including the downfall of democratically elected governments. And China has not played a similar role, I mean, to that extent as the United States. But as a rising power, I think Zarni has already mentioned this. For example, a late rising power would need to carve out its space in the world. And, it's already been mentioned that like Japan, like Germany, and even, yeah, as Didi said, the United States. Many people think that the rise of the United States was a relatively peaceful process in comparison with other colonial projects from Europe. But the Philippine experience will show that it is not, it was not so, at least from the turn of the previous century. So the complexity of the violence and along its borders, particularly today, and we are looking, for example, at the South China Sea as a possible flashpoint for future conflicts. And these conflicts may not be resolved in a, like just like a flashpoint. Conflicts over this area may last or may intensify. So we should be very wary and careful about this situation. So I think that the notion of a completely peaceful rise of China is something that, although none of us want a war or a global war to happen, none of us. But that is what happens when these major powers come into each other, and there will be a certain point that that China will have to, face seriously the U.S. military force. So so I think what was mentioned earlier about the non-aligned forces, non-aligned movement earlier on in the 20th century, I think that's something that we should consider in Southeast Asia, to develop a community of nations which will assert and preserve our economic, social, and political well-being. Not as I am not implying here that we should go back to the kind of autarkic nationalism, or we're all bound together as a community, but a community that should be more protective of the people. Now, there's a difference in perspective in what I'm talking about here, because most of us want to talk about these problems from the perspective of the state. But I myself, I've been working with labor unions, with indigenous peoples, with student movements, with human rights activists, and these deals which the Philippine state is entering into with China affects all of these people at the grassroots. And if we work with the people at the grassroots, with the young people, with the idealistic people, then we know we are protecting the environment, we're protecting women's rights, we're protecting the rights of the indigenous peoples. You may say that this is all for nothing in comparison with the power of the United States or China, but that is the meaning of our struggle. What else? What else can our struggle mean if it's not fighting for the rights of the ordinary people? So the perspective should change. I think that we should not always be talking about states in struggle or conflict with each other, but we should be talking about people's movements, about the people asserting themselves and defending their rights wherever they may be, in even the smallest and furthest, most far-flung islands in our archipelagos. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ramon. Yeah, so now I would like to take, this question is related to the Kiao Piu deep sea port and in Myanmar. So I would like to ask Dr. Zarni this question. The question is, certainly at the political level, both Burmese and Chinese regimes have their own political agenda and interest, but at the Pew socio-economic perspective, how would the Burmese and Southeast Asian people benefit from the port? Would the people be better off without the port socially and economically? If the port is by and large damaging to the well-being of the people, what is the alternative? Dr. Ramon.
But, you know, the Chinese presence, I mean the economic presence, developmental presence in Western Burma is very much tied with the Burmese genocide. Yeah, the clearing of the beachfront neighborhoods, many of which belong to Muslims of Arakan or Rakhine. How could you say that a economic project or developmental project like Deep Sea Port that was rooted in the genocidal violence of the Burmese state is benefiting the local people? I mean, you know, I mean, whoever asked that question did not do his homework. You know, the offshore gas exploration. Look at, I mean, like, you know, Rakhine State, where these projects, multi-billion-dollar projects are located, are, you know, in the middle of unfolding genocidal project by the Burmese state, and you know, intensifying the Rakhine and Burmese internal military conflicts. Yeah, and so I think, you know, that is the question arises from you know, the questioner not looking at the situation at a you know, at the root level. But in terms of the well-being of communities, and also, you know, Tansri hit the nail on its head. This politics of, like, you know, racial identities, religious identities within the larger context of national political state is rather damaging to the well-being of the people, the society itself. We cannot have national communities based on simply calculated economic interest. There has to be a shared value. That value is not this liberal or Western or European. That value has to be predicated on the welfare. Yeah, if welfare of all communities across Malaysia or across Southeast Asian regions as a whole, then we can have a common agenda, common position at the national and ASEAN level. Whatever exogenous or external hegemonic powers may come to our shores with their own expected agendas. Yeah, and so we cannot have political states that are based on, or that rest their identities on, one single faith or one single ethnic identity. So I think that we've got a lot of homework to do in our own national communities. So the emergence of national identities based on this, political and economic well-being of everyone who calls Malaysia their home, who call Myanmar their home, has to be, front and center of our national foreign policies. And then finally, Didi asked the question: why are predominantly Muslim states such as Indonesia or Malaysia within ASEAN keeping quiet when millions of Uyghur Muslims are put in what German researchers call concentration camps? Yeah, whether it's China is committing a genocide intentionally, it is being debated. What is not being debated is 1 million or 2 million Uyghurs are put in what definitely looks like forced labor camps, if not extermination camps. So we have a major problem. Yeah, when the OIC is not acting as a Ummah, the Islamic faith community that transcends national boundaries. So we are having a crisis of values as national communities, or even civilizational community such as OIC.
Thank you, Dr. Zarni. Yeah, so on this point, I would like to ask Tansri, this question. So Tansri, question for you is: why do you think there is no statement by government, by the Malaysian government, in Chinese interfering in Malaysia's national affairs, or even the plight of the Uyghur oppression? Why do you think Malaysia is reluctant in voicing out publicly against China? Are Malaysians too afraid of offending Chinese leaders?
Thank you very much, Najib. Very interesting and difficult question for me to answer. But let me say this. I think, first of all, in diplomacy, this is what my perception of what Malaysia looks at. There are two parts to diplomacy. One is public diplomacy, where you speak out your views and trying to influence the members of the public. The other part, where Malaysia feels more comfortable, because maybe it feels that there is some vulnerability issue about bilateral relations or multilateral relations with a few countries. They do what is called quiet diplomacy. They bring it up, but not publicizing it. They do it in the quiet of discussion. But I do not know whether in the case of Malaysia, because I'm out of the government, in the case of Malaysia, they have done so or not. I believe that once our policies were premised on three things that's important when we are discussing about our national interest. One is that we must take a principled position. I think many countries now have amended, or I think have diluted the meaning of principle. Principle is totally, if it is going to hurt us, we wouldn't, even though it is principle in terms of values, and what Zarni was talking about, the value. And then the other thing, it must be consistent. And of course, now, principle and consistency has not given the importance. The most, what is being done is that to be pragmatic. So when you rely everything on pragmatism, it means that anything that can hurt you socially, culturally, economically, politically, you tend to keep quiet. OIC was not addressing this issue of in Xinjiang, because the Chinese have shown that their treatment, they have brought in quite a number of people, opinion leaders. They brought in opinion leaders to show that everything is okay, from Malaysia, some ministers. But you see, there is a different treatment between people in Xinjiang and other Chinese Muslims, the Hui Muslim, so because they have adopted the Chinese culture, everything that, their names, their language. But Xinjiang, because it was incorporated into China subsequently as an autonomous state. So they have got their own ethnic or national identity, even though they accept the fact that they are part of China. So this one, it seems that has provoked the feeling. And in fact, if you look at the transmigration policy of the country, they are in the town areas, I think there are now more Han's Chinese than the Uyghur, So all these things are, I think maybe the United Nations is also very weak. Part of our biggest problem is the smaller countries or the Muslim countries. None of the Muslim countries are members of the Security Council, permanent members. They are not in a position of influence. They are within the sphere of influence of other countries. So I think, if I can put it in a nutshell, they are playing safe. Okay, thank you.
Yes, so okay, so well, I'll take one last question from the audience. Yeah, so before we conclude this session. So the question I would like to ask this question to Didi. Yes, so the question is: China has been reported to use a "I scratch your back, you scratch mine" approach in getting countries to comply with the BRI initiative and awarding contracts to Chinese state companies. At the government level, do Chinese officials pressure, threaten, or blackmail government officials in ASEAN countries to accept these imbalanced contracts, thus encouraging government officials to engage in corrupt practices?
It's nice of this question. Oh, nice of you, Najib, to give the question to me. I feel unqualified to answer it. I think maybe somebody who knows more about ASEAN could give a better response to that.
Yeah.
But what I would like to say, while I still have the microphone, is just very interesting, because Xinjiang does take us back to the BRI, which we were talking about as the topic of this event. I think it's important. Tan Sri mentioned that other Chinese Muslims, such as the Hui, are being treated differently, although that's a little bit, that this practice is encroaching there too. It is very much an ideological problem. The Communist Party doesn't like alternative ideas or religions or faiths. It fears them very greatly, actually. But Xinjiang is on the route of the BRI to Central Asia, to the West, to the Black Sea, all of that. And it needs to be cleared, if you like. All these dangerous ideas, religion, this and that and the other, which are not communist. They don't want that they don't want the ideology, let's just be honest, particularly. They need to be dealt with in order to clear the route through to Central Asia from Beijing to project the power. I do think that's a big part of why they're being attacked so fiercely and so really awfully, actually. So thanks very much. I wanted to make that point.
I think Didi's point is just spot on. Because if you look at the Rakhine, situation, the genocide and the military conflicts, there's a genocide, one directional, state-directed, persecution with the intent to wipe out the Muslim presence in Rakhine, and then Buddhist against Buddhist conflict, which is the Rakhine nationalists who used to be a sovereign state, a kingdom, and the Central Burmese Buddhist. That control the military, they're fighting. That is part of this, clearance of the BRI route, if you will, in Burma. There is a China-Myanmar economic corridor, and the Rakhine state is very much an integral part of the China-Myanmar economic corridor. So in the case of Xinjiang, the China directs the clearance operation, in the form of ideological clearance, clearing dissident voices from within the Uyghur community. In the case of Myanmar, China protects Myanmar state that does the clearing, and so that is why China has been a major blocker of any type of meaningful international effort at the Security Council, and other international fora when it comes to this, the ongoing genocide against Rohingya. So these are two related cases that are tied integrally to China's grand strategy of BRI. So these are not, isolated, criminal cases, one by Chinese state directly and the other by Myanmar, with the protection and backing of China.
Thank you, Dr. Zarni. So we are coming to the end of this session. So before I conclude, I would like to give each of our panelists 2 minutes just to sum up. Yeah. So maybe I'll start with Professor Ramon.
So I'd just like to thank everyone and also the listeners, and also for the great questions. So I did learn a lot, and I hope you will have more dialogues like this in the future from different perspectives and from different countries in Southeast Asia. And thank you very much.
So I'll be very, very short. Thank you very much. I think it's been most productive and very constructive discussion. I agree with Professor Dr. Ramon that I think we should have more of this type of discussion where we will be able to engage. And I think most importantly is people have taken part in the chat in the IFB, and they have, they have given quite a lot of good questions. Thank you for organizing this for both the organization. Thank you.
I also, just very briefly, thank you very much. I've really learned a lot from all of you. And I hope to learn much more about ASEAN, about Philippines, about Myanmar, of course, too, Malaysia, Bosnia too, I hope, Mr. Softic. So yeah, it was fantastic. I won't take up any more time. I think I've said enough. So thank you, Najib.
I think we need to organize a Southeast Asia-wide conference online amidst COVID in the next several months. If ASEAN leadership is unwilling or unprepared to have honest dialogue on this issue, I think the activists, scholars, and other concerned citizens across Southeast Asia should organize a conference on China and Southeast Asia. That we should also invite the Communist Party scholars and officials, if they want, to come and have their views heard. Yeah, and that we cannot move away from China. We are geographically tied to China, and vice versa. So the best approach would be to have these issues out in the open and let them confront our understanding that China is an imperial power trying to, relive its Middle Kingdom myth, and let us confront them face to face about what they're doing in Myanmar or the Philippines, South China Sea, and Shenzhen.
To Dr. Zarni, for these for the advice. So with that, before I close, I would like to thank all of you, our panelists, and also our audience who have made time for this session on a Saturday morning or afternoon, wherever you are. And also, I would like to let you know that we have a webinar coming soon. It's end of the month on the 30th of January, and the topic is about the challenges in online teaching post COVID-19. Not post, during. It's not yet over. So it is during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the panelists will be our prominent Malaysian surgeons in the US, and also prominent educators and public intellectuals. So I would like to invite you to join this session as well on the 30th January. So with that, so thank you very much. So I would like to thank the team at FORSEA and also the team at the Islamic Renaissance Front for putting this webinar together today. And I hope all of you, we've had a wonderful session. We've learned a lot of things. So thank you very much, and we look forward to having you again for our next session, by the IRF and its partners. Thank you very much.